Okay. So if you remember, we so far have talked about the scope of public economics or the role of the government to some extent. We talked about externality and we have talked about efficiency. Today we'll talk about market failure. And I have talked about market failure very briefly in the initial lecture. So these are the fundamental questions that one should ask when we talk about market failure. Now, these six questions in front of you will give you a very good idea about market failure and particularly the role of government. First question is, as you can see, what are the reasons behind market failure? Second, if there is a case of market failure, then what the government can do. Third, this third question you can relate to our last lecture. Basically, it is related to the second welfare theorem. Even if the present scenario gives you a Pareto efficient equilibrium, even if that happens, the government goes for redistribution or reallocation of resources. Why? Predominantly, the answer is lying with that efficiency equity debate. Now, fourth, we have talked about public goods. We have talked about a little bit of common property resources. Then we'll again ask a new thing. Then what is a merit good? There is a particular class of goods which we'll call merit goods. Fifth question is related to the second and third question. These second and third questions can be clubbed together again in view of the above analysis to ask the role of redistribution. And finally, do we have some alternative perspectives? Okay, so that's the structure of this maybe a couple of days lecture on market failure. Now, in our last lecture, we have seen one thing that if I leave it to the market, then competitive mechanism, that Adam Smith's invisible hand, will lead to Pareto efficiency. Now, the question we also raised in our last lecture is that always true? Actually not, particularly in presence of externalities. Remember, when we talk about the equilibrium condition, if you remember, it's MRS equal to relative prices equal to MRT. That's the efficiency condition. Now, MRS is marginal utility of good 1 by marginal utility of good 2. But that is the private utility. If that is not equal to the social benefits ratio, which is social marginal utility of 1 divided by social marginal utility of 2, which is possible in presence of externalities, these conditions are not met. So even if apparently I have a perfectly competitive market mechanism, but presence of externalities rules out Pareto efficiency. And in policy perspective, how can we look into the problem? how can this problem be explained in terms of policy prescription? There is a direct link between atmospheric or environmental pollution and the rise of cancer. So, if you have more pollution, that means there exists less taxes on polluting industries or polluting production processes. Two things are happening parallel. One, due to excessive pollution, the prevalence of cancer goes up. Two, because this production is at the market equilibrium, not at the social equilibrium. That means, if you remember negative externality, so we have overproduction. We could have brought it back to the social optimal using certain taxes. Now, in absence of such taxes, not only I'm overproducing, which means I'm overpolluting, but also the government revenue falls. I could have earned more revenue through putting higher pollution taxes. Now, if I do not have sufficient government revenue, the funding in research for cancer that will go down. Correct. So look, when we talk about certain economic mathematical jargons like Pareto efficiency, first welfare theorem, second welfare theorem, these things are not actually intangible academic things. They have a one-to-one bearing with the policy that governments take. The second problem is inequality. Not only if I leave it to the market, I could have, if you just imagine a particular Edgeworth box, two people sitting in the southwest and northeast corners, origins, right? Depending on that initial endowment, if I leave it to the market, competitive mechanism will lead to a particular point on the Pareto set. Well and good. But that point might be located either towards the southwest corner or to this northeast corner. It can be anywhere. So I can see, at least visually, if that point was more towards the middle of the Edgeworth box, I would have said that the distribution or the final allocation of resources, final allocation of goods among the two individuals or two groups of individuals are a little bit equal, equitable. But the first welfare theorem does not address that issue. It addresses only one thing. To start with any suboptimal allocation, leave it to competitive forces, take care of externalities, you'll get a Pareto efficient outcome. But it does not address the problem of inequality. So, whether it's a case of market structure, which is failure of competitive mechanism, whether it's a case of externalities, market failure happens. So the three things we need to first point out are in a particular situation. Now, from one situation, the other situation will differ. And that is why, if anyone asks you what is the basic difference between a policy prescription and a theoretical prediction, you have one answer. Theory is generic, Policy is case specific. We cannot have any particular development policy which suits every society, every country, every person. Had there been, there should not have been any poverty in the world right now. No country would have been underdeveloped, right? So every particular economic structure that we study has its own problems. I'm deviating a little bit here. We talk about a number. Okay, your when is your Indian economy course? In which semester?
In the current
Going on.
semester.
Current semester. Very good. Look, if someone asks you what are the development models or the development policies the government of India has taken which are successful, answer is zero. Why? Let's start to a particular policy like Green Revolution in the 1960s. So, in a brief, I'm just deviating a little bit so that you can relate it to the actual or practical policy making. So, theory does not remain pure theory because only theory is a little bit, I will say, intangible. Until and unless I apply the theory, I do not need to have a theory. The theory should be applicable, right? So, after independence, India had only two things. One, certain sterling pound reserves left by the British, and a democratically elected government. Now, why democracy is important, that you will understand in a uh, very brief manner at the end of this particular course and at length when we talk about welfare economics and social justice theory. Because, particularly, again, let me give you a brief idea. What is democracy? It is basically dependent on a majority voting theorem. You have an agenda, there are different people voting for different agendas, and the majority voting leads to the elected government. What does that mean? That means there is actually certain agendas which did not win. That means there are certain set of people which are worse off when the majority voting outcome is established. I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about economic agenda. I'm talking about socio-economic agendas. I'm talking about distribution, relocation, redistribution of resources. So majority voting and democracy, basically when we talk about elected governments and the role of government, we do have a proper theory behind it. And that is economic theory. So I'll not shift from that domain. Now, with that majority voting thing, the government started on a development of the present new freely independent nation. And we had 5 years plans. Initially, government said all the small sector, agriculture, cottage industries, whatever, blah, 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 leave it to the private sector. All the heavy industries will be under public sector. And we call that the Mohalanobis model, the second 5 year plan. But in doing so, the government was in a soup because of back-to-back famines and the 1962 India-China war. There was a huge shortage of agricultural output. People died out of hunger. So the government's policy shifted, and we have in the late 90s, mid 1960s, 66, 67, we have the Green Revolution. But is Green Revolution a policy which is beneficial to everyone? After 20 years, we see no, absolutely not. It was very, very beneficial for Punjab, Haryana, certain parts of Uttar Pradesh, but absolutely not beneficial for Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Bengal, Odisha, all these states, northeasts. So I take a policy, I implement that policy by keeping a Pareto principle or a Caldor principle or a Rawls principle in mind. So all these principles I will teach you later. I will introduce you to later. But so far you can understand the Pareto principle. I want to make a particular set of people better off without making others worse off. Good. But that policy was not successful in a lot of states which were agriculturally significant, like Bengal, like Tamil Nadu. Now the question is Bihar. Now the question is then why we take policies which are not beneficial for everyone? Answer is there cannot be a particular policy which is beneficial to everyone. Cannot be. Because we are lying in the domain of majority voting. So the moment you select an agenda through majority voting, which means majority of people have voted for that agenda, but there is still a minority. So the policy which is being implemented is detrimental for the minority. And that is the place where the government again pitches in for redistribution. You take a policy, implement the policy, see who is better off, and you identify who is worse off. The moment you find who is worse off, you redistribute certain resources from the better of good to the worse of group. We call it a compensation principle. So you compensate the worse of group so that they are neither worse off nor better off. So this compensation principle becomes very, very important. And that is why we see so many compensation principle based policies like direct benefit transfers, direct cash transfers right now in our policy portfolio of the government. And that is why even if the situation is Pareto efficient, the government does intervene to address either market failure or externality or inequality. So we need to find out exact source of market failure in this particular market in study, and depending on the cause, the exact intervention. And that is why this debate on decentralization. So decentralization of governance is intrinsically linked to welfare economics. Okay. Now, now another role of government, which we might think very important, is, if you remember, to remove externality, to internalize externality, is to define property rights. Because absence of property rights is again a big source of market failure that we have discussed. Remember, one field with corn, one field with sheep herding. So there is a particular thing which again is a subject matter of different subdisciplines of economics, what we call a tragedy of commons. I think a number of you must have heard about this phrase, tragedy of commons. So there is a common pool resource If you leave it to the society, people tend to abuse it rather than use it. So there is over extraction of resources. It's just like fossil fuels. Analogy with environmental economics I'm giving you. We know the rate of depletion is far, far higher than the rate of replenishment for natural resources. Now, if a particular natural resource is a common property, no one is going to take care of it. It's because there is no incentive to maintain or improve that property. And that actually happened in the Soviet era in USSR. Because a lot of properties were government owned or public owned. So people used to stay, people used to go, people used to do whatever they want to do, but no one took the responsibility of maintaining because mostly is public. So what we need to understand, the first intervention that the government should come is to define and enforce property rights through contracts. So the moment you give, and that is why we have so many public private partnerships coming up right now, should have come much before. Otherwise, just think anyone from a particular city where there used to be red colored, like Bombay. Anyone from Bombay here, or Bengaluru, or Kolkata, or Chennai, whichever. This is very frequent in the metro city. When we are young kids, we used to find red colored uh, public buses, state bus, we used to call them, whether it's KSRTC, whether it's WBSTC, whatever. Now, the way the drivers used to drive the bus and the maintenance of those buses was pathetic. Now you bring in the public-private partnership under JNUM, National Urban Renewal Mission. So you subcontract it to certain private players who are in charge of taking care of the bus, give a certain return to the government, and make a profit out of it, whatever is left. Running very efficiently. So defining property right, even it's a government bus, when I have taken a contract to run it for say 1 year or 11 months contract, I am responsible for it. Whatever profit I am making out of it is also mine. So you incentivize, you give incentive along with responsibility. Okay. Now, yeah, this I have talked. The first fundamental theorem, welfare economics, it does not include market failures because the moment I have a market failure, markets are no more Pareto efficient, and there is a rationale for government to pitch in. Yeah, that's what I have talked about. Now, the first and foremost reason behind market failure is failure of competition. Now, what is perfect competition? Perfect competition. Okay, I just want to give one more point, which is a little deviation from the current thing. Most of us, we think that if there are a huge number of sellers, huge number of buyers, will have perfect competition. No, that is neither necessary nor sufficient. The sufficient condition for perfect competition is price taking behavior by each and every agent in that market. Now, we particularly in our regular life, perfect competition is hardly observable. Even if you go as a student to purchase some vegetables or fruits from the tech market, where there are multiple fruit sellers, you will find the prices are almost equal. And they do not negotiate, they do not bargain. Why? Because there is a cartel or collusive behavior among themselves. So, not necessarily multiple players will necessarily lead to price taking behavior. Price taking behavior is more observed in, I will say, wholesale markets where things are auctioned. So everyone thinks, okay, this is a price. Such a small player, I cannot make any difference either as a buyer or a seller by the quantity purchased or quantity sold by me. But in general, what we see monopoly, we see oligopoly, and we see monopolistic competition, not duopoly. Duopoly is actually a subcase of oligopoly. So what we see is limited competition, because even a perfect monopoly is also very hard to be observed, except for a few cases like Indian Railways. Okay, so price taking might fail. Another thing is the production structure of a particular industry. So not only price taking, the other thing which is very, very important for profit competition is constant returns to scale production technology. But in general, what we see is IRS, or increasing returns to scale. So what is the implication of IRS? The more I produce, the marginal cost of production comes down. Correct? Now, think of a particular industry with multiple farms. And when I have multiple farms with multiple plant size, the farm with the largest plant size will have the least marginal cost of production, and he can actually outcompete everyone to become a monopoly. Finally, there is geographical indicators for competition. Take for example, we always talk about iceberg transport costs. What is that? When I transport a particular good from one place to another, some portion of the good gets damaged or depreciated. So, like iceberg, only 1/10 is visible, 9/10 is below water. When I'm talking about shipping of goods and commodities, the cost is basically iceberg in nature. I can see only the fuel price, maybe the price the shipping companies charging me, but a number of costs are below the point, which means invisible. And depending on different types of buyers in a market. If you remember, I talked about different types of buyers in the sense of willingness to pay for a public park or something, pricing of a public good, D1 and D2, two different types of maximum willingness to pay curve. So now, if there is a particular farm who has significant market power. Might not be a monopoly, might be a oligopolistic firm, but geographically might be a monopoly. Take, for example, uh, the neighborhood Kirana shop after 9 o'clock. There are no other uh, groceries in and around. So they have a geographical monopoly also. So they can charge different prices at different times of the day. Similarly, there is this option of arbitrage. Someone purchasing from a low price person and selling it to another person who is willing to pay higher price. How? Again, quite visible, particularly in this lockdown days, it became really, really visible. These vendors, vegetables vendors, who purchase from the initial market place, then put it behind an MAT or a bicycle or a tricycle rickshaw or a Toto, whatever electric rickshaw, and then go door to door vending with a much higher price. So you segment the market. You charge different prices from different segments of the market. So look, all these lead to failure of competition. Collusion and cartel, I have given you an example. Entry restrictions through credible threats. Now, this is something it's a favorite example of mine when I teach subgame profit Nash equilibrium in game theory lectures. But uh, entry restrictions through credible threats means threats in game theory parlance is credible or not. Okay. So a particular threat is credible when the person who is giving the threat is also incurring a cost if he has to execute the threat. Because threat in itself does not come alone. It comes with a promise also. Threat and promise are the two sides of the same coin. So the promise is, I will not harm you if you abide by this set of laws. That's the promise. And the threat is, if you do not abide, I will harm you. The entry restrictions. Take for example, the classic example was in USSR itself. Initially in USSR, Pepsi was a monopoly. Coke wanted to enter the market. The moment Coke declared that we are going to come to the USSR market, Pepsi said, I do not mind, but I will charge a set of prices like this if you enter the market. Those prices were even less than the marginal cost of production for Coke. So there is a very high fixed cost when you enter. So you have to take a call that whether Pepsi can be so much aggressive or not. And the threat was credible because Pepsi was already a monopoly in that particular part of the world for a long time. So they were deep pocket players in the USSR market. I'm not talking about US market. I'm not talking about European market. I'm talking about the USSR Soviet market. Now, from their pile of profit reserves, they can actually subsidize a loss for this period. So that was a credible threat. And why that threat was credible? Because if the threat is executed, Pepsi is also going to incur the loss. But Coke rationalized that yes, the moment we enter, they will behave so aggressively in the Russian market, they will also incur loss, but they can finance the loss because they are deep pocket players. Another example of failure of competition is patent, which is again given by the government itself. So you invest in R&D, you get a process or product innovation, and you patent it. The moment, what is the meaning of patenting? For a particular period of time, no one can replicate, duplicate that process or product. So, particularly for that particular process or a particular product, you become a monopoly for a certain period of time. Again, failure of competition. So, the simple analysis that we have to do is somehow get back to the good old MR equal to MC and find out the deadweight loss. Because the moment I have deadweight loss, either through collusion cartel, either through restrictions through credible threat, or through patenting, or through transport costs, IRS, whatever, all these reasons. If I have a deadweight loss, I have a case of market failure. The moment I have a market failure, then depending on the nature of the cause, the government has to act to ensure competition. Now,
Sir, I have a doubt.
sure, please go ahead.
Sir, you mentioned about vegetable market, like vendors, wholesale market and street vendors will
Mm,
failure competition. Sir, how is it
mm.
a failure, sir? Like, if
No,
a
no, no.
street vendor is coming to my home and I'm purchasing from the home, obviously the prices will be bit more than the wholesale market.
Correct.
But I'm getting I'm saving my time and also the fuel cost, I mean transportation cost to go to the market and those things. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, but who is speaking right now?
Sir, Ashok Kumar. Ashok.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Look, Ashok. Uh, which department are you from?
Sir, mining.
Right. Okay, Ashok. Now I understand because the moment you asked a question, this question, I could clearly understand the confusion that you have. When I'm talking about a market, I'm talking about only that market. You're saving transportation cost, you're saving time. These are different markets. When I'm talking about vegetables, I'm talking only about the vegetables market.
Okay.
Market, when I'm saying that, look, I'm
Okay.
talking
Okay.
about market failure. Which is a market? Now, this is a very serious question. Very, very serious question. We all must have to understand. When I use the word market failure, failure part I understand. But what is market? Market is the space where different agents interact either through demand or supply of a particular commodity or service. So if I talk about vegetables market and the example I gave of market segmentation, I'm talking only about vegetables market. So in the wholesale market where there are numerous sellers and numerous buyers, no one can affect the price of the vegetables through his purchase of them. Remember, if I talk about a equilibrium price and quantity, basically I'm talking about a demand curve and a supply curve. But those demand and supply curves are aggregate demand and supply curves. So if I think of a particular farm selling a particular vendor selling vegetables in a wholesale market, the demand curve it faces is not a downward sloping demand curve. but an infinitely elastic horizontal demand curve. Why? Because whatever he has, however he supplies everything to the market, will not reach the price. Because we know if there is an excess supply in the market, prices should come down. So I am such an insignificant player that I just cannot supply anything which can create excess supply in the market. Similarly, from a purchaser's or a buyer's point of view, I will demand something from the vegetables market, but I cannot demand so much that have a marketing power. I cannot behave as a monopolist. Now, in the wholesale market, all the vendors will try to outcompete each other, and hence the prices are perfectly competitive prices. Now, I purchase there in that perfectly competitive price, load them in a van, go to a particular posh locality where I know people are really, really scared about COVID. They don't want to come out. And why I said posh? Because they do have certain wealth for which they can afford to stay at home without losing income. And I sell it with a markup. I purchase at 20 rupees a kilo, I sell there at 40 rupees a kilo. Even if I take what is the cost of my production there? 20 rupees a kilo at which I purchased, and say 2 rupees a kilo per kilometer I have traveled. Suppose the distance is 5 kilometers. So the my total cost is 30 rupees a kilo, but I sell at 40 rupees a kilo. Why? There are no other vendors who can outcompete me there. Either take it or leave it. This is the price I am quoting. The moment you do that, what you have done, you have delinked the buyer from the wholesale market. And you have used certain resource like a travel vehicle or something and clubbed it with the opportunity that you have to sell there and make a markup. So in that locality, posh locality, when there is only one vegetable vendor lying around and selling door to door, the buyers cannot say, why are you asking 40 rupees? The other person is asking 20 rupees. Because there is no other person asking for 20 rupees a kilo. So perfect competition breaks. At this moment, this vendor is a price maker rather than a price taker. Is it okay, Ashok?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, public goods, as we have seen, are either underprovided or not provided at all. And what type of public good I can think of? Example of anchorage, as you can see as a bullet point. And what is that example of anchorage? Anyone knows what is anchorage? Anchorage with a capital A. Anyone?
Alaska.
Correct.
Alaska.
That person. Who gave the answer?
So me, Abhinav sir.
Pardon? Pardon?
Abhinav sir.
Avinav. Excellent. Excellent. Anchorage is a small place in Alaska. Why is it important? All the transatlantic flights refuel there. You leave US mainland, stop at Anchorage, refuel, and come to continental Europe. That used to be the case predominantly till 80s and 90s when those jetliners did not have that much fuel efficiency or did not have that much fuel capacity. Like a flight from Florida to Dublin, Anchorage would be a very nice place to stop. Or a flight from San Francisco to Japan, or Zurich, San Francisco Zurich flight. Now, Anchorage is one of the major navigational waypoints, not only with airplanes, but also with fishing lines, shipping lines and fishing lines. And depending its nearer location to the Arctic Circle, what happens? You need to have real-time data on weather, because whether you refuel or not, that's the line all international long route airliners take. Now, if you put up a weather station there, the weather update hourly is very, very crucial. And that is not only available to the airline people, also available to the local shipping and fishing lines. Because Anchorage is also a hub for uh, prawn lobster fishing. So all these reasons, navigational aid, either you have to purchase. Now, how can you purchase navigational aid? How can you purchase hourly weather update? Predominantly through a public service in form of a radio station through Anchorage. Now, until and unless there is sufficient demand for it, you will not be provided. Remember, when I talked about pricing of a public good, if the vertical intercept of clubbing both demand curves, suppose that is 300, and if the marginal cost is more than 300, it will not be provided. So if you want to price a public good, if you leave it to the market, it might be provided, but obviously underproduced. It might not as well be provided. But as you can understand, all the airliners, all the fishing lines, all the shipping lines, they are willing to pay. But again, free riding issue will be there. And that is why availability of public goods become very, very crucial. Okay, it's already 1 o'clock. So no problem. We will continue tomorrow. And let me stop sharing now. And we'll finish this tomorrow. No problem. So if you have any questions, please go ahead. In the meantime, let me stop recording so that it's available to all of you.